I'm Curmudgeon Film Talk. This is Out of the Cast, the film noir themed podcast. And I know what you're thinking. That's an abysmal name for a podcast. And you're right. It is. Today's topic is Fargo, not the 1996 film, which we will get to. The topic today is the television series, which started in 2014 and is ongoing. And we're going to do this a season at a time. Unless we don't, in which case we won't do it a season at a time. We'll see how we feel. So let's start with Fargo Season 1. Let's just jump right into it. Tom, Green Ornstein, Mr. Ornstein, if you will. Mr. Ornstein, will you please describe the setup for Fargo Season 1?
It takes place in the town of Margie, which is Minnesota, bordering on North Dakota. There's a lot of snow and everybody has a somewhat Canadian-esque accent.
Yeah, it's that Midwest. Is it Midwestern? I don't know enough about the infrastructure of America, but yeah, very, very thick, very kind of comedically overdone.
Yeah, and it focuses on a interwoven narrative of a lot of interesting characters. Well, first and foremost, Lester Nygaard, played by Martin Freeman, essentially the bumbling loser, got a kind of a dead-end job. His brother's doing better than him. His wife is clearly not interested in him anymore and openly belittles him. His life is turned completely upside down when he encounters the enigmatic yet charismatic hitman Lorne Malvo, played by Billy Bob Thornton. And from that, he is essentially inspired to take his life into his own hands by brutally beating his own wife to death. He is also inadvertently responsible for the death of the chief of police. The hitman Lorne Malvo getting more integrated into the town and causing all sorts of chaos. They are both being chased by Molly Solverson, played by
Alison Tolman. Alison Tolman.
She's the cop trying to link everything together, in spite of the fact that she's essentially on her own because the rest of her police force are quite inept.
You basically have this really bread and butter noir kind of setup where this drifting hitman, Lorne Malvo, coerces, for lack of a better term, a down on his luck, downtrodden nobody that is Lester Nygaard into killing his own wife, basically. Let's talk about that scene when they first meet in the hospital. In many ways, that scene summarizes the tone of Fargo and what Fargo does so well.
Obviously, people know it's based on a Coen Brothers film, and especially the Coen Brothers are technically known for their rather quirky comedy built with rather serious issues intertwined, and you can see this really well replicated into the series.
Quirky comedy is as good a description of it as you can. And I know what I'm about to say isn't Coen Brothers related, but I was watching an interview with the writer of The Sopranos, and he made a comment that I think is really resonant and really applies to Fargo and applies to that opening scene particularly well. That scene isn't even the opening scene, but I'd say that scene is the inciting incident. But David Chase says something, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says something along the lines of, people are kind of averse to blending drama and comedy, or blending like the more morose, perhaps macabre aspects of life with comedy. And what he says to that is that's just not a realistic way of looking at life, because life, like, you will find comedy in the most obscure places. But you get this setup where Lorne Malvo's in the hospital because he has been in a car accident, and Lester is in the hospital because he had a run-in with Sam Hess, this school bully,
and unintentionally ended up hurting himself rather than the bully. Yeah. Like that's new levels of pathetic right there.
And just sheer ineptitude. But it's a great character moment because Sam Hess doesn't even touch him. He hurts himself by flinching and going headfirst into a paint glass
door.
That's just a beautiful little piece of character writing there. He is his own worst enemy, in as much as his sheer patheticness, if that's a word, is his detriment.
I think especially in terms of, like we said, sort of blending comedy with the more serious elements, the correct way to do that is, in a way, through character rather than through comedic situations.
But you get this scenario where these two characters have, in a sheer stroke of fate, have ended up together in this room. And in the course of this conversation, Lorne Malvo functionally summarizes what I would describe as the atmosphere of the show. So it starts with this kind of quasi comedic, awkward little back and forth between an unusual stranger and Lester, whereby we're watching Lester ineffectively try to drink a grape soda, which he cannot do with a broken nose.
And even the ways that he's trying to make himself sound tougher, ironically makes himself sound even weaker. Like, oh god, the whole oh yeah, well I kind of humiliated him too by saying that Sam Hess was...
See, I don't think that was him. I don't think that was him trying to sound tougher. I think that was him basically being sheepish and weak-spirited. He's not willing to admit that he has been wronged. He's trying to make it sound like it was a more fair scenario than it was, which it obviously wasn't. But in either case, you get this demonstration of just how quickly and just how effectively the writers in this show, the lead writer being Noah Hawley, just how effectively they can just shift the tone just like that from comedic to dramatic. And so they're having this conversation where he's explaining that Sam Hess had sexual misadventures with Lester's wife in high school, and for some reason he's apologizing for that, and this encounter has ended with him being physically harmed and he's apologizing for it, and Malvo just turns to him and bluntly says to him, if I were in your position I would have killed that man. And all of a sudden the tone shifts, and a lot needs to be said about Billy Bob Thornton's performance, which is just an exceptional performance, but all of a sudden that kind of banter between strangers is replaced by that macabre underbelly. And I think Fargo, for the most part, does that really well. I think what separates Fargo, what separates the Coen brothers kind of noir, they're no strangers to noir. Obviously, they did the '96 film. Even looking at their earlier noir films like Blood Simple or The Big Lebowski as well, they're no stranger to noir, but they find this beautiful way of imbuing their screenplays. And Noah Hawley continues this tradition perfectly, of imbuing their screenplays with a sense of humor that doesn't force them to relinquish the macabre, which to me is so essential to a good noir film, is that feeling.
Yeah, it doesn't overbear you with the comedy, regardless of how humorous or funny these individual, I wouldn't even say jokes, just humorous situations that they find themselves in. It's never so much to overpower the overwhelming sense of threat and crime, and which again is how I said that you should do it. Make sure you execute comedy through character.
That's exactly what you get with Lester Nygaard flinching and nutting a pane of glass, breaking his own nose. I think it is also essential that the comedy is so deeply situated in the macabre, so they're not separate. Just look at Don Chumph getting brutalized.
Oh god, yeah. It's difficult to even describe.
Let's just assume whoever's... I mean, this show's been out for ages. If you haven't seen the show, then just watch the damn show. That entire scene with Don Chumph getting brutalized is hilarious in a way you can barely describe. It's like it's so excessive, and Don Chumph is such a pathetic character. Like, everything about him is a cartoon. The ridiculously over the top accent that they all have, the bronzer that he wears.
He got on the note.
He looks like he's rolled around in Cheeto dust. He's such a pathetic character, and you feel sorry for him because he's not like a fundamentally bad person. Nevertheless, you're not endeared to him enough to not find his death completely hysterical. Like, the music swells and they're all like shooting him, and it goes into slow motion, and he's like flailing all over the place. It's ridiculous. So it helps that the comedy is so firmly grounded in the macabre, and so the comedy and the macabre are never separate, and so it can transition between the two perfectly.
Yeah, the one thing I always thought about Fargo, and this is true of the film as well, it's quite similar in a ways to something like Edgar Wright's Hot Fuzz, in a sense where like something so horrific takes place in a town that's so unassuming and creates this rather bizarre setup, but in a way that just ends up working a lot in its favor.
There's a lot to be said about the setting of Bemidji as a place. I'd like to kind of linger on the fundamentals of film noir and how important setting is to film noir. And I'm glad you bring up that rural aspect, because I would say Fargo for me is the quintessential rural noir. And there's no secret that the noir typically takes place in the city. The cityscape is sublime. The cityscape is this terrifying, monstrous, mechanical. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen The Asphalt Jungle, which is a classic of noir.
No.
There's a line in The Asphalt Jungle where he basically, says something to the effect of, "The city is a machine, and it goes on regardless of man." It is this thing that is more powerful than you and can consume you and can destroy you. You don't know who's lurking in the corners. The city is this perfect locus for the high contrast lighting. You just look at the opening scene of The Killers and those stretched shadows pooling down the streets. Fargo takes a step away from that, and it instead replaces that large, overbearing city with the rural town.
I always viewed it as one tiny thing, whether it's a kidnapping in the film or the existence of Lorne Malvo into this town. It's almost like how such a tiny bit of corruption can erode this homegrown atmosphere. And it's almost like something that they've barely experienced before.
Yeah.
So I think that's why it's interesting as opposed to the city setting. Because with cities, you get things like Chinatown is an example, where it's like it happens so often and they say, forget it, it's Chinatown.
Yeah, forget it, it's Chinatown.
It's
this is the place where that happens. Even though Chinatown basically doesn't take place in Chinatown. The movie Chinatown is named after Chinatown, yet the actual location of Chinatown really only comes into it at the very end, but it's constantly there in dialogue. You're reminded of it constantly.
It's almost quite like Fargo in this, which is...
I have my opinion about that, and it has a lot to do with values, and it has a lot to do with the corruption of values, because I think you bring up a really important aspect, which is that it's this small town, this traditional, close-knit community, and they're not used to this level of carnage. Lorne Malvo convincing some random guy to commit a murder sets off this huge chain of events that he cannot expect it to, because Sam Hess, who he kills really for no other reason than just for fun,
because he could,
because he likes to toy with people, and he's toying with Lester, and Sam Hess ends up being connected to this huge Fargo syndicate who send these two hitmen, Wrench and Numbers, and that leads to several murders, including the previously active police chief in Vern, leads to his death. It leads to this string of destruction, like a trail of bodies, no matter where he goes, that shakes this small town to its core. And I think that is the importance of the rural setting, because the rural setting represents traditionalism in a way that the city cannot. The city is modernity, and we will talk more about that when we get to season 2, because that is the entire theme of season 2. But there's a little bit of that in there. I mean, Wrench and Numbers are from the city. You get that impression with them particularly, as well as with Lorne Malvo, but more with Wrench and Numbers, because we know they are from the city mob. They invade
the outsiders. You get
the outsiders invading the rural space, and in doing that, they bring this corruption of the human spirit with them. Nowhere is that more apparent, and this is where we begin to get to the core of Fargo, the philosophy of season 1. With that corruption of the human spirit and that feeling of disillusionment that comes with it. Bob Odenkirk's character is one of my favourite characters in season 1, because he's inept and he can't look at a body without wanting to vomit, which makes him baffling.
Wrong profession.
Wrong profession, yeah. But you get that really beautiful dialogue between him and Molly Solverson, and we will get to Molly Solverson in a bit, because she's just an exceptional character. She's such a great lead, but he says to her something like, I'm not cut out for this. I never saw myself to be the type staring into the fire, drinking, thinking about the way of things. And I'm not quoting exactly, but it is that idea that he wanted the white picket fence lifestyle.
Yeah, you want your kind of small town values rather than having to think about your own place in the universe.
Yeah, which he's not ready for. And that is why one of the core sort of threads, like you said, Molly Solverson is really working against the police force because of Bob Odenkirk's character, because of his character, because he is the active police chief after Vern dies, after the old police chief dies, and he cannot admit that Lester Nygaard, this guy he knew in school, this guy he's known all his life, who represents that way of the past, he cannot accept that he has been corrupted. That is one of the most beautiful things about noir. That feeling of revelation, of revealing what the world actually is. Now I want you to talk about your little trifecta of characters, because I think this is where that's important.
You have one side which is law enforcement, in this case represented by Molly Solverson. Mm-hmm. On one side you have essentially what is pure chaos or an outsider, in this case represented by Lorne Malvo.
The criminal aspect.
Yes, and on the third side you almost have I would describe it as an outsider out of their depth.
Or not an outsider, but the civilian, the perfectly average citizen who ends up, through one means or another, getting reeled in to crime.
Yeah. For example, you could look at Molly Solverson against Lorne Malvo, where you can argue that one is while one of them is as just and well-intentioned as you could be, one is as anarchic and ill-intentioned as you could be. Again, it just creates this feeling of all the forces in play in, again, like I said, in just this tiny town. It's almost like you don't want to admit that these rather nuanced things are rather interwoven, especially in a town, like I said, like Bemidji, that prefers more traditionalist values. I remember I used to initially, I know this isn't true, but I initially thought that this is based on a true story aspect. I always used to think that was like the characters trying to admit that to themselves, in a way of saying, like, Christ, this really happened.
I find that idea interesting, because you bring up the topic of complexity, of the complexity of the plot, by virtue of the fact that you have basically three characters binding two storylines together. So it is not a simple picture. And that is reflected in season 1 in itself, actually, because you've got Bob Odenkirk is running with this drifter theory. His idea of how Vern was murdered is this very basic, extremely uncontentious theory of a drifter. Just somebody coming in, getting hopped up on drugs and shooting them. That is all he can manage, not just intellectually, but I think part of that feeling of revelation, of realizing how dour the world is or can be, part of that revelation is realizing how complicated it can be, and how it isn't as simple as you want to believe. It isn't as simple as a drifter. It isn't as simple as a stack of pancakes in the morning. But I also think what you're describing is a structure which epitomizes that corruptibility of the human spirit, because you have Lester Nygaard, just a nobody, and I think, in my opinion, season 1 does this better than the movie, but I will explain why in a moment. So you have Lester Nygaard, who is just your average schmuck. He's your average Joe, and he ends up being coerced into committing murder of the first degree.
Quite easily.
Quite easily. It shines a light on the precarity of the human spirit and the precarity of the moral compass. And the scary thing about it is that if you've seen Fargo, you know that you actually root for Lester a little. You can't help yourself.
Yeah, I feel this comparison of someone like Lester Nygaard is, of course, Walter White from Breaking Bad, in the idea that two civilians get into something much darker than they ever have, and they end up not just liking it, but they end up thriving in it and discovering themselves.
Yeah, I think where those two differ is that Walter White discovers who he truly was. Lester Nygaard, I don't think that's true. I think Lester Nygaard learns to be a different way. He becomes a different person than he is at the start. It's much more of a sense of transformation, whereas Walter White, as soon as he no longer has death to fear, you actually see the cracks in the facade, whereas with Lester it's a little different. The important thing to say is that the precarity of the moral compass and the corruptibility of the human spirit, epitomized by Lester Nygaard, you kind of experience it yourself because you actually root for him. And there's a limit to that. But the thing is that he is so downtrodden and his wife is so cruel to him. And obviously it does not excuse murder. That's an important thing. But it's like, you're certainly not sorry for Sam Hess to go.
Even if it's not by the correct means, you feel like he had it coming in a way. So you're almost happy with whatever you can get.
But it is, the simple values of good versus bad, and the simple values of a murder is just a murder. A murder is just a drifter. It can't be anything more. They disappear into the cruel, complicated reality that there is a conspiracy at play, and that your old buddy from school is just as capable of turning out to be a murderer as a drug addict drifting. I think it does it better than the 96 film, because in the 96 film you have Jerry Lundegaard, is that his name?
Yeah.
He instigates the plot himself. And obviously he's in over his head. He's totally incompetent. He's totally inept, and it all goes horribly wrong. But in an attempt to weasel money out of his father-in-law, he stages the kidnapping of his own wife, which results in her accidental murder. So it's this ineptitude, but it still begins with him already being a horrible person. You know, whereas with Lester, he starts off as like a nice guy, like he's pathetic, but he's actually a nice guy, and in ways you can't even describe, he's corrupted, and in ways that you can't even describe, you are corrupted, because you genuinely root for the guy to a certain degree, to a certain end.
Obviously, with the film, I remember the first time I initially watched it and was kind of disappointed because it was, you know, when you read a description, it tries to summarize it and said, you know, a pregnant cop has to deal with a crime in her town, and it gives that more clear-cut three-act structure. But if you watch the film, it's, you know, centers Marge Gunderson, McDormand as the main character, but she doesn't turn up for like 40 minutes, and then you realize that it's more of an anthology in the similar sense the series is of three stories turned into one. So in a way, it's almost like Fargo is a setup that is better explored in a TV serial, which is probably a good motivation for making it a TV serial. So
yeah, I mean, the thing is, at the time, television was not the respected form that it is now. So it's unlikely that a couple of auteur directors like the Coen brothers are going to go off and make a TV show, even if it works better as a TV show, which it definitely does. But that story of Lester Nygaard, it represents the ambiguity of morality so much more aptly for me, because he is corrupted. There is a much more definite sense of him being blackened in a way, for lack of a better term. You know, just to go back to the rural setting, I also think there's a lot to be said of the sublime, because I use the term sublime when I described the cityscape. I used the term sublime. Do you know what that means? Sort of.
Not entirely.
Okay, so the sublime is a very multifaceted term, but I'm going to kind of base it on the kind of originating text, which was a book written by Edmund Burke called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Sublime and Beautiful, or something like that.
That is a long title.
It's a long title, and I'm not. That's not even the full thing. But the sublime is like this experience of both beauty and terror. You know, of both awe and terror. When you look at an incredible mountainscape, and so often the sublime is equated with nature. When you look at a beautiful mountainscape, it is beautiful. It is this incredible, awesome object. But it could also destroy you. If you went into a dense forest, for example, without the proper means to survive, it would kill you. You know, there is no morality to nature. Nature is not governed by the same kind of ethics as humanity. It is this amoral structure that is greater than you and more powerful than you. And when you are absorbed into it, it overwhelms you. The cityscape is the man-made sublime, because the cityscape, in the same way as the forest or the mountain, is completely devoid of any kind of sense of ethics or morality. You know, it is this mechanical structure, and it can destroy you. It can consume you. You know, it's unnavigable. It's labyrinthine. It's dark, and within these dark passages, there are dangerous individuals. But there's a lot to be said of the sublime, of the rural setting as well. The rural setting, I suppose, in that sense, gets back to a more traditional idea of the sublime, that more traditional idea of an environment being overwhelming and dangerous. You know, later on, you've got Molly Solverson actually getting shot by her own ally because of a snowstorm, because of the thick snowstorm. You can't see. There's danger, there's an intensity. It's all consuming in a kind of a more traditional interpretation of the sublime.
As you talked about the idea of sublime blending both beauty and horror.
Or not horror, but terror, like terror more than horror.
Yeah, a sense of threat of some sort, which naturally makes you think, brings up the idea of predatory animals, in a sense that something can be fantastic to behold, but you're also aware that if you get too close to it, it will kill you.
But Lorne Malvo comes into the centre of that as almost like the human embodiment of nature. It's really strange. And you have that situation of him swerving the deer. Clearly he has this respect for nature in a way that he does not respect the human race, or the sanctity of life, for lack of a better term. To the degree that he hits the deer, he doesn't intend to, but he brings it in from the cold, so it doesn't die in the cold. They find it in the boot. You know, it's this beautiful little character moment, but this is sort of epitomized, if you will, when he has a run-in with the character played by Colin Hanks, this highway traffic cop. Lorne Malvo really gets by being fraudulent. He will embody different characters. He's chameleonic. he will lie. Functionally, he's very, very good at it. He can manipulate people by pretending to be someone else. So even if the police literally have him in a holding cell, like they do, he is able to get away because he's very, very good at lying. He's chameleonic. And so Colin Hacks says to him, how can you just lie like that? To which he says,
did you know that the human eye can see shades of green more than any other colour?
And he says, do you know why that is? And he can't give him an answer. So he says to him, once you have an answer to that, then you'll have an answer to the question you asked me. And of course, it turns out that the reason for that is predators. It's functionally an evolutionary piece of biology to distinguish predators in dense greenery. And it kind of epitomizes this idea very similarly to a character like Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men. Lorne Malvo is a force of nature. It's part of what makes Lorne Malvo terrifying, is that he is a force of nature. You know, everything he does is a survival instinct. Him lying and being manipulative, for him, it is just survival.
I think he is aware of how easy it is to break apart smaller systems, or whether it's on a, on a more personal level. I mean, we saw this with Don Chump. The idea that he can just come into his life, manipulate him, and then essentially discard him, is that it's almost like he's done this so many times that he's aware of how people think when they are not as aware of what the world is really like than he is. He's so aware of it that he can bend the world to his will.
Yeah.
And he does that essentially for laughs now.
I would personally linger on that, on the idea of him doing it for kicks, because for me, Lorne Malvo being a force of nature is kind of like a representation of the pure id. Like him screwing with people in unforeseeable ways, sometimes resulting in, as in Lester's case, results in the death of several people. Him messing with people is just him enacting his own weird fetishistic engagement with the world, pure and simple. There is no ego to stop him from doing that.
After he meets Lester again in the diner, he says that you think there are rules, but there aren't.
That is one of the scenes where you really begin to actually sympathise, really morbidly sympathise. And this is why Fargo is such a great noir, is that it puts you in a position where you, whether you like to or not, you sympathise with criminals. And you find yourself sympathising with Lester. And functionally what Lorne Malvo says to him is this beautiful monologue of, it's a red tide, this life of ours. It's this brutal thing, And sometimes you've got to show people that you're an animal, that deep down you are still an animal. Otherwise you're going to get washed away. And it's that prospect, it like zooms in on Lester's face as he says the words washed away. And you just see that look in his eyes where it's like, this man has been washed away his entire life. And this is the opportunity for the id, the animal, to come out.
Yeah, which it comes out with a bang.
Yeah, or a hammer. Let's talk about Molly Solverson. Because she is a fantastic protagonist. So, what do you know of like the typical noir protagonist? What would you expect of the typical noir protagonist?
I'd say the main aspect would be a sense of jadedness, almost like an acceptance that things cannot get worse than this, or if they do, you're not surprised. Sort of like your soul has been worn out. I think that's the overall idea of the noir protagonist, which we've seen reflected so many times.
You look at your Humphrey Bogart character. I mean, I know the Swede in The Killers is not the protagonist of that movie, but he epitomizes that, where he can't even be bothered to save his own life because he's so jaded. The Stranger, it's the exact same thing in The Stranger. Your noir protagonist tends to be so accustomed, Rorschach in Watchmen, they tend to be so accustomed to the seediness of the world that it corrupts them, and that they become this shadow of themselves, and they develop a certain ambivalence or apathy. Perhaps a survival mechanism, but regardless, there is that apathy. There's no sense, generally speaking, in the noir protagonist, there is no sense of a really strong moral compass. In the old classic 50s noir, the private eye was typically riding a line. The private eye as a profession rides the line. They are not law enforcement and they are not crime. They are somewhere in between. Do you think the same can be said about Molly Solverson?
No, I definitely don't think I could. Obviously, we don't see much of her career as a police officer prior to this, but you could argue this is the first major event like as we mentioned, the old noir protagonists have already experienced the events that would jade them. The event currently is the one that would jade the protagonist.
Yeah. Right off the bat, Molly Solverson is not coming from the position of someone who has so much experience in criminality that it's broken them down. She has kind of like a fresh-faced feeling about her. She's very unusual as a noir protagonist. So is Margie from the 96 film. There is something kind about her, even in her demeanor. She doesn't have that kind of like street-smart wittiness that you get with your Humphrey Bogart, you know. She talks very quickly and there's almost like an innocence to her. But does that make her a bad cop? Does she do a worse job because she doesn't fit the bill of the stereotypical noir protagonist?
No, I mean, the one thing that even Vern notices in that scene in the diner in the first episode, that he notices that at least she has a strong instinct. At least it demonstrates that she is a critical thinker, which especially in the line of a cop would be incredibly useful.
But let's linger for a moment on that idea of the corruptibility of the spirit. Her spirit is incorruptible. She is a true paragon. She is kind. She's maternal. You know, that's something which Margie is as well. I mean, Margie is pregnant by the beginning of the 96 film. But more than anything, she's a woman. You know, which might sound like nothing, but it's really not. In the noir genre, Molly Solverson being a woman is a really important thing. And same with Margie. Because the noir genre, I keep calling it a genre, which it basically isn't, but the noir, for lack of a better term, genre, the noir genre is typically codified by like a male subjectivity. And the femme fatale is like, in those traditional noir films, the femme fatale is the expression of a fear of female subjectivity, a fear of female empowerment, a fear of female freedom, sexual freedom. Molly Solverson is the opposite of all of that. She is the opposite of the jaded, masculine, morally ambiguous protagonist. She is completely morally sound. She's morally sure. She's kind. She's polite. And she's feminine. She's totally feminine. It takes this fascinating leap from what you expect of film noir into this whole new realm of female subjectivity. So let's imagine for a second that Molly Solverson represents the female subjectivity. Lester Nygaard, I think, represents the male subjectivity. He's a bit of an incel. You know?
A bit. And that was actually the term as we were talking about the fact that he like I say, he injures himself and kind of tries to pass it off as nothing. The word incel was flashing through my mind.
He's an incel, basically. I know that's like a horrible, seedy term to use, but it kind of represents him pretty fully. The murder he commits is against his own wife. So the murder he commits is instantly of a, if not a sexual nature, a gendered nature.
Yeah.
And him gaining confidence is often equated in that kind of gendered position. You know, the final act against Sam Hess is that he has sex with Sam Hess's wife.
Yeah.
You know, it's him becoming a man. You know, that's what she says to him, isn't it? She says to him, or he says to her, I was trying to be a man, and she laughs at him. So instantly, like the act of murder and these inciting incidents, these instigating factors are immediately codified in the realm of masculinity, in the realm of gender. And that criminal element, I would argue, is therefore equally codified in the topic of masculinity. So right off the bat, you've got this situation where Molly Solverson represents a shift in noir towards the female subjectivity as a protagonist. And the villain, which really is Lester Nygaard, that is what she's aiming for. That is her crowning jewel, is to nab Lester Nygaard. But Lester Nygaard represents a very gendered depiction of a man. His entire plight is to do with gaining masculinity, trying to gain some kind of masculine footing, trying to be a man. You know, it is that very line, I was trying to be a man, that leads to an argument that results in him killing his own wife.
It's like, you spoke out against me, therefore you get hit.
Kind of not even just that. It's more like him enacting masculinity in the circumstances. Him enacting masculinity equals murder.
It's almost like it's the first time he's got it, so it's almost like it. You know, like when you get the first taste of something, maybe of a substance or a feeling, and it's almost like you get hooked on it straight away and you don't.
It's overwhelming.
Yes,
you know?
That is the word.
And I think that's a really important thing, and I think it's a really important part of not just Fargo, but noir as a whole. Because think about where noir has come from. And noir, this needs to be said, noir is a response to society to some degree. Noir is always socially situated. It is socio-historically situated. So noir, dating back, 1941, the Maltese Falcon, came from...
the first noir.
The very first noir film is generally credited as being Maltese Falcon, which is a horribly boring movie. Don't watch it. But I'm not kidding. It's really dull. But the Maltese Falcon, dating all the way back to 1941, it's situated in wartime and post-war anxieties. And without going into too much detail of what that entails, let's talk about gender for a second and where gender comes into that.
Okay.
So imagine you are a man in 1945, an American man in 1945, right? You've come back from the war. And in the case of some noir films, you have this feeling of distrust of the female partner, a fear of adultery. Then you have the added factor of women being ousted from the workplace, because a lot of women were assuming roles and economic independence and vocational independence in the absence of men being conscripted or going off to fight the war. And when the men come back, women doing a perfectly good job are ousted from their jobs to be replaced with men. And so you've got this tension of the genders. And this is a really basic way of putting it. These are just my own kind of interpretations, but you begin to get this burgeoning independence of women. Economic independence, you've got women sort of blossoming in the workplace, extraneous to men. And so it's more than just a tension between the genders. It is, from the masculine subjectivity, from the masculine viewpoint, it is a fear of that female empowerment, which is so often sexual, but not always. And in that you get the femme fatale. If we place Fargo against that framework, it's a really important thing. It's a really, the movie in 96. In the 70s, you begin to get, with like second wave feminism in the 70s and 80s, you begin to get a recalculation of the femme fatale. Chinatown is a really good example of that. And I mentioned that before. In Chinatown, you have this character of Evelyn Mulwray, and she is assuming the role of the femme fatale at the beginning. And Jake Gillis is distrustful of her. And to a degree, he even believes her to be responsible.
Yeah. He
thinks that she is behind it all, and then it turns out she's actually a victim. She's a victim of a horrible crime. Again, also a sexual crime.
Yes.
And the fact that her father raped her is evidence of it being, broadly speaking, a crime of the patriarchy. So in the 1970s, you're beginning to get a recalculation. Then when you get to Fargo in the 1990s and the continuation of that in 2014, it's not just a recalculation of the femme fatale. It's not just a recalculation of the woman's place in noir. The woman is noir now. The woman has assumed the role that was assumed by the traditionally masculine figure, And much like in Chinatown, the crime itself is situated against a patriarchal framework. It's situated against a framework of an emasculated individual attempting to seize control of his masculinity, and it results in a murder. And I think that is fascinating, and I think that is so important to understanding why Fargo is awesome and why it fits into the beautiful tapestry of noir so perfectly.
Yeah, I agree. So I just want to reiterate that, just to ensure that I understand it. You're saying that with characters like Lester Nygaard and that need for creating sort of a dominant force of masculinity, in a way it links into what was to an initial aspect of the noir.
Yes, but I think Gus Grimley is interesting as well, because Gus Grimley is effeminate. Gus Grimley is decidedly less active than Molly Solverson. He's not a good detective. She's a great detective, and he's just a traffic cop.
Yeah, I'd say that he's definitely one that is going against the grain, especially in that kind of character. Even the fact that he's a single father, taking care of his daughter, and they have quite a nice relationship. You'd usually expect that kind of closeness.
Yeah, normally you expect a kind of estrangement between the father and the daughter. It maternalizes him as a character, his dedication as a father.
The best thing that I can think of that encapsulates that idea that it's almost like he doesn't want to be that kind of person is when he says that I never wanted to be a cop, I just want to be a postman. He doesn't have to prove... It's nice in some aspect, because he's in a profession that naturally you would have to prove that you are that kind of head honcho. I don't know why that's the term to come to head, but I'm rolling with it. I'm rolling with it, yeah. But no, all he wants is just, he wants a nice life. He wants to get on with his daughter. It's kind of ironic that with Gus and Molly, they're counters to not just their respective gender stereotypes, but of their stereotypes of the noir, and yet those two end up together, which is...
Yeah, it's beautiful, and I love that, because part of the trajectory of Fargo Season 1 is getting to that point where they reinstill normality. Lester Nygaard is killed, Lorne Malvo is killed, the bad guys lose, and the good guys prevail. It ends with them sat on the couch together. The family unit, them sat together on the couch, is just this like traditional picture of the nuclear family, with one difference, which is that Molly is the nucleus. You know, she's the nucleus. She's the one sat in the center. You've got the daughter on one side, and you've got Gus on the other.
I think his daughter pokes fun at him, saying that he's afraid of spiders.
Yes, yeah.
He just sits in the couch and says, well, you know, Buzz Aldrin was afraid of spiders, and look what he accomplished. It's not just an awareness that they are against type, but they don't feel any shame in it.
They don't feel any shame in it. I think you're absolutely right. I think that's really important. And I love that line at the very end, because he gets a medal for, should we say, apprehending Lorne Malvo. And he says they should be putting that medal on you, and she says, oh, I don't mind, I get to be chief. She assumes the top of the power dynamic. In gender discourse, that's an important thing. And the fact that it ends with her assuming not just the nucleus of the family, but also assuming the top of the food chain, I think is so important.
We can definitely say without doubt that she's earned it. It certainly wasn't something handed to her.
Yeah. I almost feel like that's a pretty good note to end on, but I feel like...
That's a nice wholesome note.
It is built upon the foundations of a very tried and true kind of filmmaking, which is film noir, television noir, yet it advances it.
Yeah.
Do you have a favourite character?
I'm going to have to say Lorne Malvo. It's like, as detestable as a human being he is, I could watch that guy for ages.
Is he detestable, though? He's pretty likeable, as far as hitmen go. He's pretty likeable.
I mean, in the sense that you know that he's the antagonist, but you enjoy the hell out of watching him.
I've got to say, Wrench and Numbers. I got to give it to Wrench and Numbers. I find him really likeable. I think Wrench and Numbers, the deaf hitman and his buddy, communicating entirely in sign language, and they're such an entertaining dynamic. But yeah, Fargo is just an exercise in great writing. I'm very excited to talk about season 2 and season 3. Oh my goodness, how does a person end a podcast? What do they do? What do they say?
I could end it with a really bad pun.
Please don't.
I wouldn't say that Fargo is a noir. I'd say it's a noir.
Oh, that wasn't good.
I wrote that down.